Hello, and welcome to the National Archives Foundation's virtual program series. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the Foundation, and we're back. What a year 2021 has already started off and turned into. We're delighted to have you joining us from home today, and I'm pleased to start off this year by hosting the next edition in our Presidential Library series. We've got the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library on deck today. Through this foundation programming, we are pleased to open the virtual doors of the National Archives and its 15 billion records and documents and our past to you, the American viewers at home. Our guest speaker today will be taking your questions. So as always, I invite you to put your questions in the YouTube chat and to practice. I see we've got a lot of folks who are already practicing. Put your hometown and state in there and I will give you a shout later on in the program. Our featured speaker today is Paul Sparrow. Paul wouldn't have a job today, and frankly, neither would I if it wasn't for Franklin Roosevelt, who created the National Archives by signing legislation in 1934. He subsequently opened up his presidential library while he was still in office. This is a feat that is not matched today by our current presidents. Paul is the director of the Franklin Roosevelt Library and Museum. Before the FDR Library, he was the deputy director and senior vice president for broadcasting and new media at the museum. He was a founding partner at the University of Maryland's Future of Information Alliance and a pioneer in interactive digital media. Prior to his work at the museum, Sparrow is an Emmy award-winning television producer. He started his television career at KPIX in San Francisco, and I saw we've got some folks from California, so will have to let us know if they know your work, Paul, from California in that time. Are you with us, Paul?
I'm here, yes. Thank you, Patrick, for having me here today. I'm really pleased to be part of this series. I watched them and they're fantastic.
Terrific. We're delighted to have you. Before we let you jump in, I have to ask, how are you doing? How's the staff doing with the pandemic and everything?
Well, as you know, the National Archives has taken a very conservative approach, and staff health and safety has been the #1 priority. So we've been closed to the public since March. Our staff is healthy and well. We started bringing some of the staff back on part-time, but then as the infection rate increased, we've closed back down again. But we're hoping that with the vaccine and with the trends we're seeing, that hopefully we'll be able to get back to work soon.
That's it. Fingers crossed. We're all looking forward to that. We miss our visitors. Well, I know you've got a great presentation to give us, so I'm going to get out of the way, give you the screen and the mic, and afterwards we will obviously take Q&A. So again, I invite our viewers, if you would like to ask a question, don't feel like you have to wait till the end. You can get them in the chat box as Paul's talking, and we'll try and get to as many as possible when we get to the Q&A. Paul, it's all yours.
Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate that. And welcome to you all. I'm a huge fan of the National Archives Foundation and very, very pleased to be able tonight to talk to you about Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, who I think are probably the most important couple in 20th century American history. If we can start with our first slide, go ahead to the next one. So Franklin Roosevelt, really was the son of Sarah and James Roosevelt. You can go to the next slide. And here he is in 1900, as he just graduated from Groton and about to head off to Harvard. He had a truly privileged childhood, growing up here on the Hudson Valley on the riverside on 1,000 acres of property with a summer home in Campobello and family had an apartment in Manhattan. And he really was part of the very privileged elite. Next slide, please. There were 2 branches of the Roosevelt family, one branch that lived up in the Hudson Valley, that's the Franklin Roosevelt side, another branch which lived out on Long Island, and that was the Teddy Roosevelt side. And this is Eleanor Roosevelt in her wedding dress, and she was given away by her uncle, Teddy Roosevelt, who happened to be president of the United States at the time. Her mother and father both died when she was young, a child, and so she became sort of Teddy Roosevelt's surrogate daughter and part of this big Roosevelt family. Next slide, please. Now, Franklin and Eleanor had seen each other at family events while they were growing up, but as he was graduating from Harvard, he really sort of fell for her. And this is 1905. This is right after the wedding. And as you can see, they were a handsome couple, and they were the melding of two branches of this family. And as Theodore Roosevelt famously said to Eleanor, "It's good you're keeping the name in the family." And of course, their wedding was scheduled for March 17th because her uncle, Teddy, was going to be in New York for St. Patrick's Day. Because as his other daughter once commented on him, Teddy Roosevelt liked to be the baby at every christening, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral. Next slide, please. The young family grew quickly. Eleanor was not a great mother by her own admissions in her autobiography. She had not had a nurturing mother growing up because she had been orphaned so young, but she started having children. And then in 1910 or so, Franklin Roosevelt gets into politics, runs for state senate. And when Woodrow Wilson is elected president, he is appointed as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and they all move to Washington, D.C. Now, the wife of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy back then had very, very specific and rigid social responsibilities, calling on the wives of other naval officers, hosting these events and things. And Eleanor was not familiar with the Washington social scene, so she needed someone to help her. So she hired a young girl from a very prominent family, next slide, please, named Lucy Mercer. Now, Lucy was very efficient. Her family was on hard times, but they had a really aristocratic background, and she was very, very good at her job. And during this time, as Franklin Roosevelt was sort of rising to prominence in the Democratic Party, they were a power couple. So when the war breaks out, next slide, please, Franklin Roosevelt's role as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy becomes very important. He actually goes, this is a photograph of him in France in 1918. He had just flown on an airplane for the first time. You can see him with the helmet coming down off the plane. And he was over there to inspect the naval operations. There was a tremendous effort, obviously, of getting all of the American soldiers over there and the materials and the supplies. And he was really in his element. He loved the Navy. He'd studied naval history from the time he was a young boy. And of course, you all know that in 1918, there was a terrible epidemic that swept the world, a pandemic, the Spanish flu. And as FDR was coming home from the trip to Europe, he got quite sick. And when he arrived at home, he was taken off the boat in an ambulance and put to bed. And Eleanor Roosevelt began unpacking his things. And in the process of unpacking his clothes, she discovered a bundle of love letters from Lucy Mercer. And it turned out that her husband had been having an affair with her social secretary. Now, this is a really seminal moment in both their relationship and in some ways in 20th century American history. Because as, you can go to the next slide, please, as they are struggling with this is a photograph taken in 1920, they're trying to decide whether they're going to stay together or not. And Eleanor offers to grant Franklin a divorce if he wants one. Now, Franklin was in love with Lucy, and there was a great moment where the whole thing could come apart. Next slide, please. But Franklin's mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who was a very, very powerful figure in Franklin's life, told him that if he divorced Eleanor, his political career was over and she would disown him. And so Franklin and Eleanor came to an understanding. Franklin agreed that he would never see Lucy again, and that they would continue on as a partnership. There was, 5 children that they had to take care of. There was Franklin's political career, and so they decided to stay together, although clearly the relationship was fractured. Next slide, please. Then the next year, 1921, Franklin gets polio. And this promising career of this dynamic, energetic, very, very strong Democratic leader is suddenly thrown into some question because polio has seriously handicapped him. The photograph there is in Warm Springs, Georgia. He became very interested in this polio rehabilitation center that he was trying to develop down there in Georgia. And he sort of disappears off the scene. Meanwhile, Eleanor Roosevelt becomes the public face of the Roosevelt name. She starts attending meetings. She joins the Women's Democratic Coalition. She becomes very active. And as she becomes more active in this case, she's keeping the Roosevelt name alive. So after a few years, Franklin gradually comes back into the political scene. Famously in 1928, he runs for governor of New York, becomes governor of New York, and his political career is launched. Now, very few people realized just how physically handicapped he was at that point. He was essentially paralyzed from the waist down, and yet he developed a walking style that allowed it to pretend, people knew he'd had polio, but to pretend that he wasn't that severely crippled. Next slide, please. Now, the two of them were an incredibly powerful and dynamic campaign. When he decided to run for president in 1932, as the Depression raged across the country, Eleanor was a real strong supporter and a wonderful surrogate on the campaign trail. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see several things that are classic. FDR standing up, you wouldn't know he was paralyzed from the waist down, wearing steel leg braces, but he's holding on to the railing so that it would appear as if he could stand. And when he would walk, he would always hold on to the arm of his son or his bodyguard or someone like that, and usually have a cane in the other hand, so it would appear that he could walk. He won the 1932 presidential election with a very large majority and came into the White House with this very progressive agenda to remake the way the federal government interacts with the American public. And of course, Eleanor was really very strongly committed to this. She was a very strong progressive. She believed it was the federal government's job to help people who needed help. And she was, in many ways, the conscience of the administration, whereas Franklin Roosevelt was much more pragmatic. He wanted to get things done. And that was always the question, is how do you get what needs to be done, and yet meet the goals and ideals of Eleanor Roosevelt. Next slide, please. One of their most remarkable abilities was that both of them were the masters of their media. And during their era, newspapers were the dominant source of information, but radio was emerging as really the best way to communicate people, a way to transcend the political editors of the newspapers and really communicate directly with the people. And Franklin became an absolute master of the radio. Famously, he becomes president on March 4th. He was the last president inaugurated in March during the midst of a terrible banking crisis. Banks are foundering all across the country. In his first fireside chat radio address, he tries to calm the country and explain that they've closed the banks. He's going to reopen the banks, and they're going to try to solve this problem. And as the comedian Will Rogers said, FDR explained the banking crisis so well that even the bankers understood what had happened. But he was so persuasive and so calming and so reassuring about the future and positive about it that when they reopened the banks, instead of there being a run on the banks, which was the great fear, in fact, people flowed their money back into the banks. And although nothing economically had changed, he had essentially ended the banking crisis by doing what he believed was the most important thing, which was to end the fear. As he famously said in his first inaugural address, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he was talking about the banking crisis. Eleanor also had a remarkable radio career. She did radio programs. Later on, starting in 1935, she started a daily newspaper column. So she had a very strong public voice, which is unprecedented for a first lady up to that point. She also became the eyes and ears of Franklin Roosevelt. She would travel the country. She would talk to people. She would come back and report to him. And so he really understood what was happening out there. And of course, there's famous cartoons about Eleanor Roosevelt showing up in unexpected places, in a coal mine or places like that. Next slide, please. So they were a dynamic team with tremendous influence on the American public. And the public was fascinated by them. Here they are sitting in the front yard of their home, of Franklin's mother's home in Hyde Park, New York. It's called Springwood. This is where he grew up, and it really was the center of his life. And when you look at this beautiful picture, you can see the rolling hills. You can still see much of this landscape there as it exists. And one of FDR's closest assistants was a woman named Missy Lehand, Marguerite Missy Lehand. She had come with him when he first ran for vice president. She was with him through his polio and as governor. And she became really almost like a chief of staff when he moved to the White House. And she took a lot of home movies. So we're going to look at some of those home movies now to give you a little bit of a behind the scenes look at the Roosevelts. We can go ahead to the video. Now here he is in Warm Springs, Georgia. Actually, so this is in the backyard of Springwood again. You can see Eleanor knitted. Eleanor knitted constantly. In footage of her, you'll see her knitting on boats. You'll see her knitting in cars and on trains. It was a way she could be productive. And Franklin, of course, was enormously intelligent and absorbed huge amounts of information. So even when he was on vacation or at his home and he came up to Springwood a lot, they would bring stacks of papers to read and to sign. That's his daughter, the tall blonde, and his grandchildren there playing in the backyard. This is the home at Springwood. Now he had a study before the library was built. He had a study there in his mother's house, which is where he did his official work. That's Missy on the left and McIntyre on the right, Marvin McIntyre, who was essentially his formal secretary. And in this room, which you can still see when you visit the house, you can see the books and the desk. And this is where he would play with his stamp collection. He was a very avid collector. He collected stamps and ship models and naval manuscripts. And one of the strange things about this situation was that they didn't really have their own home. So this was FDR's mother's home, not his home. So here they are back in Warm Springs, Georgia. There's Missy in the middle there. So someone else was using her camera to shoot this. And you can see, it's a rare footage. You can see how withered his legs are. And the reason he loved these pools at Warm Springs was that they allowed him to feel like he was able to swim and had some freedom. And he spent almost half of his fortune converting that into a rehabilitation center. So here again, here's some of the home movies of that still photo you saw. And the relationship between them at this point was very complicated because Eleanor was still somewhat removed emotionally from their relationship, and she was developing her own persona as a very, very active first lady. And Franklin was brilliant in the way he would use her. If she would come out with something, with a new idea and say something, if it generated a lot of controversy, he would say, "Oh, that's my missus. I have no control over her." But if it was well accepted, then they would move on with it. And he could use her as a bellwether. This is a party. Those are the four sons there behind them, and Anna, the daughter, on the far right. This was his mother's birthday party where the entire clan got together in the backyard at Springwood. You can see the four boys, all very good-looking young men. All of them served in active duty during World War II. And here we are as a little bit more home movies from a place near the Warm Springs Foundation. And they loved to have these picnics. They would have picnics in Springwood and Warm Springs. At the end of the first 100 days, this is amazing footage. At the end of the first 100 days, he sailed a boat with his son and a couple of boys up the New England coast to their home in Campobello, Canada. That's his son James there. And you can see he and Eleanor, she wasn't on the boat. She didn't care for sailing. And this was a man who was paralyzed from the waist down in a 40-foot yacht sailing in the North Atlantic, as president of the United States. It goes to a lot of his characteristics, which was that he loved to live life. He wanted to be an adventurer, and he loved the sea and anything having to do with the sea. Here's the media that followed them everywhere. Anything having to do with the sea or the Navy, he was just passionate about. Again, you can see here how he's standing, holding on to his son James's arm with the cane in one hand. And if you were to just see these in the newsreel at a movie theater, you would think that he's perfectly capable of standing. This is the last sequence. This is the car that we have at the museum. On the property they had in Hyde Park, they grew trees and they grew corn and other things. And everywhere they went, of course, this was a photo opportunity. And you'll see the press who were there with them everywhere they went. Thank you. Now on to the next slide. So their relationship was remarkable in the effectiveness it had in changing American politics. Most importantly, they changed the relationship between the federal government and the American public. Next slide, please. Then, of course, in 1939, World War II breaks out. Hitler invades Poland, and everything changes. The efforts around the social renovation after the Depression give way to having to prepare America, which was very isolationist, to get involved in this European war. And most Americans didn't want to have anything to do with it. Next slide, please. In 1940, as the war is raging in Europe, FDR makes the controversial decision to run for a third term, which no one had ever done in American history. He is reelected, and this is Inauguration Day, 1941, with he and Eleanor leaving the White House. He thought that he was the best person to deal with these international crises and to help transition America into a wartime footing. And he famously talked about America becoming the arsenal of democracy. We wouldn't send our boys to fight, but we would provide the weapons and materiel for England and the Soviet Union to fight Nazi Germany. Next slide, please. Now, Eleanor, so this is March of 1941. Eleanor was a strong champion of civil rights. So here she is down at the Tuskegee Institute. This is one of my favorite photographs of her because there was a lot of controversy about whether African Americans could serve in the military and what roles they could play. So she goes down to the Tuskegee Institute. That's Chief Anderson behind the controls. And he takes her up for a flight and flies her around for 45 minutes. An African-American man and a white first lady in this small plane. It was radical, but it changed the perception, and it essentially helped create the Tuskegee Airmen and eventually the Red Tails. And this was the kind of thing that she would do. She would use her celebrity, she would use her voice of authority to change the way people thought about African-Americans, about immigrants, about poor people, and she really dedicated herself to changing that equilibrium. Next slide, please. So in June of 1941, the library opened. Here's FDR in the white suit doing the opening ceremonies for the presidential library. Prior to this point, when presidents left office, they just took everything with them. All their papers were considered their personal property. And he really believed that presidential papers belonged to the American public. So he built the library to house both his presidential records, but also his collections, his books, his ship models, his paintings. His stamp collection was the one thing that he didn't give to the American public because when he died, he let his children sell it. Next slide, please. But inside the museum, this was called the Oddities Gallery, where all the little weird gifts that would come into him, either from American public or from other people, were put on display. And that large Sphinx-like head is still on display in the library today. Next slide, please. So in August of 1941, again, America still isn't in the war, but the war is raging around the world. FDR has this secret meeting in Placentia Bay with Winston Churchill, and they draft the Atlantic Charter, which is essentially the framework for why America should fight this war. This isn't a war to preserve the British Empire. This is about saving democracy. Next slide, please. Then, of course, in December of 1941, Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, and any isolation resistance to getting involved in the war goes away. Now, this is a critical moment in this transition of FDR from a regular president to a wartime president. And he goes on to mobilize the most extraordinary military alliance in the history of the world. Next slide, please. In 1942, the Americans and the British and the Allies land in North Africa. And in January of 43, he and Churchill have another meeting in Casablanca with all their military leaders. And after the meeting is over, Churchill insists that FDR come with him to Marrakesh. So here they are in the Katuba Tower in Marrakesh in the villa they were staying in. Two people had to literally carry FDR up the stairwell because it was too narrow to get his wheelchair up there. And they're looking out across Marrakesh towards the Atlas Mountains. And there's an extraordinary moment in this relationship between the two of them. The next day, as FDR is departing on a plane, Churchill turns to his aide and says, "That's the greatest man I've ever known." And he returns to this spot and does the only painting he did during the entire war of this scene. And he then gave that painting to Franklin Roosevelt. Next slide, please. Eleanor, meanwhile, takes on this role of being the mother to all of the soldiers who are fighting. In the summer of 1943, she engages with an extremely dangerous mission, and she tours the Pacific, visiting thousands of soldiers and sailors who are wounded. Every soldier, sailor she met, she would get their home address, their families would get a letter. It was an extraordinarily brave and difficult journey. You know, these were unpressurized military aircraft she was flying through a war zone. But it really showed her commitment to being supportive of American troops. Next slide, please. Then, of course, in November of 43, they have the famous Tehran Conference. And here we have the first time the big three are together. And this is really FDR at the height of his power and at the height of, you know, he's still healthy. And he is sort of the person that both Churchill and Stalin looked to, because Churchill and Stalin didn't really trust each other. And at this point, they're trying to decide on the post-war world. What's going to happen with Eastern Europe? What's going to happen with Japan? Will Russia come into the war? And it was an extraordinary moment. You know, these three men commanded, you know, a military force that even to this day is unprecedented. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, on the trip home, FDR becomes quite ill. And in the early parts of 1944, he starts really suffering from illness. D-Day happens on June of 1944, and the balance of the war starts to shift dramatically as Allied troops begin their march across Western Europe, and the Soviet troops begin their march from the east. Next slide, please. FDR, however, is in fairly bad health. That's his daughter, Anna, on the left, and Eleanor on the right. And you can see he's lost a tremendous amount of weight. Anna has moved into the White House at this point and essentially become the hostess, because Eleanor is traveling so much. Eleanor isn't as concerned about Franklin's health because she had sort of seen it slowly degrade, whereas Anna was very upset and forced them to have a test done, which revealed that he had congestive heart failure, extremely high blood pressure, hypertension, and that he needed to do some dramatic changes to his lifestyle. Next slide, please. Of course, this is also the moment when he's running for president in 1944 for an equally unprecedented fourth term. It's one of the few color photographs taken that summer of 1944 before the election. You can see the power, he's lost weight. This is the picture that makes him look as good as he could at that moment. But he runs for president and he's reelected. At this point, you know, the doctors were being pretty honest with him, telling him, if you run for office, you will probably die. You need to stop working and rest. And yet he decided to go ahead and do it anyway. And this is the moment, as they decide to run for fourth term, that he selects Harry Truman to be his vice president. Next slide, please. Then in February of 1945, the big three meet again in Yalta. It's a grueling trip, 14,000 miles. It takes a tremendous toll on FDR. They don't resolve some of the issues, such as what's going to happen with Eastern Europe. They do resolve some of the bigger issues. The United Nations, the Soviets agree to join the United Nations and to come into war against Japan. However, his health does not recover. Next slide, please. He goes, when he returns home, he goes down to Warm Spring to try to recover because the first meeting of the United Nations will be at the end of April. This photograph was taken on April 11th. He died the next day, at April 12th in Warm Springs. Now, unfortunately, one of the people who was with him in Warm Springs was Lucy Mercer, who had married a man named Rutherford, who had died recently. So Lucy was there. And when Eleanor came down the next day to retrieve the body, Franklin's cousin told her that Lucy had been there. So Eleanor lost her job, her husband, and found out that he had been seeing his former mistress all on the same day. And yet she put together an extraordinarily public face. That information didn't get out for years. Next slide, please. His casket is moved from Warm Springs, goes on a train, thousands of people line the tracks. It comes up to Washington. There's a big national ceremony. Then it comes up to Hyde Park. You can see here the casket on the caisson as it rolls up. They had soldiers and sailors lining the pathway from the railroad tracks all the way up to the Rose Garden where he was buried. Next slide, please. After his death, initially, Eleanor said, well, the story's over. She moves up to her home at Valkill here in Hyde Park. But of course, the story is not over. If you only looked at Eleanor's career from the time she left the White House to the time she died, you would still say she was one of the most important women in 20th century history. Next slide, please. President Truman puts her on the United Nations Commission for Human Rights. She chairs the committee that drafts the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She champions civil rights, women's rights. She's the most famous American woman in the world, one of the most powerful politicians in the Democratic Party. And she leaves a lasting legacy of commitment to human rights. Next slide, please. She dies in 1962, and you can see here, this is the burial site on the home. That's the marble monolith that FDR had described. The first grave with the flag is FDR's grave, and the grave next to it is Eleanor's. This is a site, as a matter of fact, in just a few days, Franklin's birthday is January 30th, and every year there's a wreath laying ceremony here, and it's a very spiritual place. Next slide, please. Eleanor Roosevelt's papers, along with Franklin Roosevelt's papers and 400 other people, are stored here at the FDR Library and Museum. We're closed right now, but obviously we are dedicated to preserving these records, making them available to the public, and telling the story of the Roosevelt legacy. Next slide, please. While we've been closed, we've been doing a tremendous number of these virtual meetings. We have almost 1 million documents online. You can go to Franklin, which is our search. You look at the master speech files, all of the documents, thousands of photographs as well. And next slide. We encourage you to join us on our social media sites because obviously social media is where you communicate. I hope we'll see you on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Got to get a selfie in, right? Paul, that's a wonderful overview. I've been looking forward to having you in the series because I have to say, before this job, I worked at the UN Foundation, and when I had the opportunity in this job to come up and visit before your arrival at the library, I remember that train ride up the Hudson and how struck I was making my way to Hyde Park, and then to see the property and the museum. So it's a great one. They're all great, but in different ways. And hopefully folks, when we get back to regular days, they'll be coming to see you. So you've mentioned the museum's closed. Before I jump into my questions, I will remind folks to get their questions in the YouTube chat box. I see some have come in, so we've been taking notes there. So the museum's closed, and in regular times, though, I know at all the presidential libraries, folks can come and do research. What kind of research are folks coming and doing? I mean, do we not know everything about the Roosevelts yet? So can you talk to us a little bit, like how many folks maybe come and do research a year, and what kind of projects, without maybe getting into specifics, are people looking into?
Well, we get about 1,000 on-site researchers every year, and then many thousands who do research online or put in requests through email or other sources. And they research all sorts of things because we have a collection that's outside of just Franklin Roosevelt's. For example, we have the War Refugee Board records, so people who are interested in the American response to the Holocaust come up. We have several million letters to Eleanor Roosevelt. So people who are interested in the Eleanor Roosevelt story. We have the family's personal correspondence. We have the whole Roosevelt family documents going back to the mid 17th century. So there's a tremendous amount of material. We have all of the map room papers. So when World War II started, FDR created a map room. So all communications from all military bases around the world would come through the map room to FDR. So at any day, any moment of any day, he could go in and see, what is happening in the Pacific, what's happening in North Africa, what's happening in the Soviet Union. We did a big exhibit several years ago about D-Day, and we found these incredible maps, which we realized these were the maps that were drawn out each day for him to see the advance of the Allied forces on the beaches of Normandy. So there's a lot of material there, and people are still discovering new material all the time. We got new home movies just a few years ago showing FDR and the White House. So material is coming up all the time.
That's terrific. And you hit on one of the questions about the materials there and what is there. related to that, is there an Eleanor Roosevelt Papers project?
Well, we've digitized some of Eleanor Roosevelt's papers. One of our goals is to, obviously to digitize all of the records here. We have about 17 million pages, so we have a ways to go. And we really want to digitize these letters to Eleanor Roosevelt because they're extraordinary. During this period, especially in the early part of the administration, when the Depression is just ravaging the country, people write to her. They say things like, I have no winter coat. You dress so well. Would you send me an extra winter coat? My father has no money. He's starving. Can you send me $5 so he doesn't starve? One African-American woman wrote that her father was walking down the street and a white man pulled over in a pickup truck and said, "Get in my truck. I want you to pick my cotton." And the 65-year-old man said, "I don't do that anymore." And the white man beat him and nothing happened. And she was reaching out to Eleanor Roosevelt for justice. So those letters we think are an incredible snapshot of America during, one of the most difficult times in our history. And we think there's great knowledge to be gained from them. At this point, you have to come up here literally and go through the boxes and look at all these letters. If we could digitize them and organize them so you could sort by state, gender, topic, date, it would be a tremendous resource.
Absolutely. And that's a major priority of the archives as well as all the presidential libraries, so you can provide more access that way digitally.
Exactly.
We always get the question about biographies. So do you have a favorite or a recommended or a couple? What do you tell people if they really want to learn about FDR?
Well, there are literally thousands of books about the Roosevelts. And if you're just starting, and you don't really know much about them, the book that I usually recommend is No Ordinary Time by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It was written almost 20 years ago now, but Doris Kearns Goodwin is such an extraordinary writer. And in a fairly easy to read book, she really encapsulates the complexity of their relationship, the complexities of their time. The title, No Ordinary Time, comes from one of FDR's speeches. And I think what's wonderful about the book is that it helps frame the bigger story. And then if you're interested in World War II, you can read Nigel Hamilton's trilogy about FDR's military commander. If you're interested in Eleanor Roosevelt, you can read Blanche Weisencook's trilogy on Eleanor Roosevelt. You can dive into different subjects that are specific because there's such a large amount of history to cover here, really, from the early 1920s all the way through to 1962.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about relationships. So it's been said that Truman didn't know anything about the Manhattan Project until he took over. So before we jump into that, what was FDR's relationship with Hoover? Because we did have the Hoover Presidential Library on earlier in our series. And then what about is the fact that Truman didn't know about the project, is that a reflection of their relationship? Can you talk about his relationships there?
Sure. So, he had a very bad relationship with Hoover. And in the interregnum period, again, back then, remember, he was inaugurated on March 4th, but elected in early November. So there was a long period in which the country was experiencing severe economic crisis, 25% unemployment, literally millions of people living on the street, homeless, farms closing, banks being closing, homes being foreclosed on. And FDR's vision for what he wanted to do, what he campaigned on, the idea of the New Deal, is that the federal government is going to get involved and we're going to help and we're going to find a way to help these people. And of course, Hoover was the old school, it's not the federal government's role to get involved in helping people's lives. You have to let the market recover. So during that period, Hoover put enormous pressure on FDR to renege and to promise he wouldn't follow up with these New Deal ideas of his and to stick with Hoover's program. And Roosevelt refused for lots of good reasons. He was elected to do what he said he was going to do. So there was tremendous bad blood between them. Hoover thought Roosevelt was a lightweight and ignorant and was going to ruin the country. He spent the rest of his life campaigning against FDR. And so it was a very fraught relationship. And on the drive from the White House to the Capitol for the inauguration, Hoover just sat there and refused to talk to him. And there's some very famous photographs of the two of them sitting there. And FDR, the charming man that he was, kept sort of trying to make small talk with Hoover and eventually gave up and just waved to the crowd. Now, the situation with Truman is very, very different. So FDR had a vice president for his first two terms, Jack Garner. And then for his third term, he brought in Wallace. Henry Wallace, who had been his agricultural secretary. But Wallace was very, very liberal and progressive, and the Democratic Party didn't want him to be vice president for the fourth term because there was such a high risk of FDR dying. So Truman was selected. FDR didn't have much of a relationship with Truman. He knew him because he'd been in the Senate, but he didn't have much of a relationship with Truman. And during that period after the election, FDR was somewhat ill. He traveled a lot. He went to the Yalta conference. He came back. He was really focused on starting up the United Nations. They only had 3 meetings. The entire file of correspondence between them is only a dozen pages. But I think FDR assumed he had more time and that eventually he would bring Truman into the narrative and explain these things to him. But there's, my theory has always been that FDR's plan was that as soon as the war ended, that he would step down as president of the United States and become the head of the United Nations, which was the organization that he was most passionate about. And he wanted someone like Truman to be president of the United States because he felt he could work with Truman and that Truman wouldn't compete with him in that role as the post-war leader of the free world. And so I think that's partly what happened there. I think it's one of FDR's gravest mistakes, not briefing Truman. The Japanese internment was a terrible mistake. And I think, not supporting federal anti-lynching laws was a mistake, but not briefing Truman was certainly a major failing on his part. I think it had to do with the fact that he couldn't accept his own mortality and that he might die and that he had a responsibility to brief Truman so he was prepared to become president.
Are there any papers that indicate that he was thinking about stepping down at a certain point? But this is just sort of historian lore at this
The only
point.
reference to it is from his distant cousin, Daisy Suckley, who spent a tremendous amount of time with him, especially towards the end of his life. She has a home up here, and she wrote it. She kept diaries of their meetings and their correspondence, and she's the only one that really has put it down on paper, saying that he had discussed this with her. But I think if you look at what he was focused on and what was most important to him, the post-war world and how these former empires like Britain and France were going to deal with a non-colonial based world, and how America would have to be one of the 4 policemen, as he saw it, that would stop another war from happening.
It was, speaking of relationships, was his Uncle Teddy influential in his presidency at all?
FDR idolized Teddy Roosevelt and mirrored his career. Like Teddy Roosevelt, he ran for state legislature. Like Teddy Roosevelt, he was assistant secretary of the Navy. Like Teddy Roosevelt, governor of New York. And then, of course, the idea of being a wartime president, he had studied, FDR had studied Teddy's, feelings about, creating the Great White Navy, projecting American force overseas. So Teddy Roosevelt was a tremendous influence on him. Although politically, Teddy Roosevelt was a colonialist. He tried to expand the American empire, and FDR felt very strongly that all those colonies needed to be freed.
And I want to remind folks they can put their questions in the chat. We've got a couple. We've got some here that are queued up, and want to welcome folks from around the country, FDR lovers from coast to coast, as you can imagine. As far away from California, we've got Omaha, Nebraska, Houston, Palm Beach, which is a little chilly in DC today. I'd like to be in Palm Beach. Massachusetts, New Jersey, Vermont, lots of folks from the DC area, South Bend, Indiana, Pennsylvania. So we've got the country covered here, and you've covered a lot of information. So let me jump into some more of these questions and encourage more to come in. So a couple of little logistics things here for folks. Is Hyde Park the same as Springwood?
So Hyde Park is a town in upstate New York along the Hudson, and Springwood is the name of the house and the property. So lots of people, a lot of the estates along the Hudson River are named estates. So people would give their names. Some of them don't even have addresses. They were known for generations as Springwood or as Millwood. So that's why there's a distinction. Hyde Park was the town, Springwood is the home.
Understood. And sort of related to geography here, was there a reason that Eleanor didn't move to Springwood after FDR's death versus staying in Bowkill?
Well, very much because it was FDR's mother's home, and Eleanor never felt comfortable there. There was a lot of tension between Eleanor and Sarah. Sarah was a very important person in FDR's life, very domineering, often overshadowing Eleanor, criticizing her about the way she raised her children. So Eleanor never really felt comfortable in Springwood, whereas Valkill was really her home. And I think that she needed that separation. Plus, FDR had planned to give the home and all of his property to the National Park Service. He'd already donated the library to the National Archives and the property that it was on. It's surrounded by the Springwood estate. And so Eleanor said, okay, give us 1 year and we will give it all to the National Park Service, and I will move up to Valkill.
And where did the Roosevelt family money come from?
Well, it's an interesting story because it really is about the wealth and development of New York City. I mean, originally, the Klaus von Roosevelt, who came to New York probably around 1660, he started out as a farmer, and then over the generations, they became investors. They owned property. They were involved with the sugar trade. They were involved with railroads. They were involved with banking. One of FDR's descendants helped start the Bank of New York with Alexander Hamilton. And so they were involved with a lot of different things. I mean, they were never of a financial status like the Vanderbilts, or the Mellons, but they were in that upper class of wealth, and that most of it came from investments.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the descendants? So we often get this question: are there any descendants involved with the library now? And another question sort of related is, have any descendants run for elected office, since it runs in the family?
So there were 5 children, Anna, the oldest daughter, and the 4 boys, James, Elliot, Franklin Jr., and John. Several of them were congressmen, ran for office. Between the 5 children, there were 19 marriages. So it was a complicated set of descendants. And yes, a number of the grandchildren are directly involved with the library. Anne Roosevelt is the chair of the Roosevelt Institute Board. Her cousin, Nancy Roosevelt Ireland, is the chair of the library trustees. There are at least 8 or 9 other family members who are directly involved either with the Roosevelt Institute or the library. The next generation, we have several great grandchildren who are now involved. So it's been a consistent sort of relationship. In the early days, the family members were not directly involved in the management of either the property or the library, but they have remained connected to us, and their support is very important.
You mentioned towards the beginning about FDR's extramarital affair, but didn't really talk about relationships that Eleanor had and how that might have impacted their relationship. Can you sort of talk about that? Give us a little context for that.
Sure, and this is one of those areas where people have to decide for themselves. There's no evidence that supports that Eleanor Roosevelt ever had extramarital sexual relationships with anyone. We know that FDR had an affair with Lucy Mercer. Again, there's no evidence supporting him having sexual relations with anyone else during the course of their year. But there's no question that there was a disconnect emotionally between Franklin and Eleanor. And Eleanor had a need for strong emotional connections. And so there was a series of people throughout her life that she developed these very intense emotional relationships with. Earl Miller, who was a New York State trooper, who was her bodyguard, they developed a very strong personal relationship. Lorena Hickok, who was a reporter covering her on the campaign trail in 1932, they developed a very intense personal relationship. Lorena Hickok was a lesbian, but we don't know what happened behind closed doors. There was also Joe Lash, who was a young student that she became involved with for the students' movement, that she kept when she died. His photograph was in her wallet. There were no photographs of her boys, but there was a photograph of Joe Lash. David Gurevich was a doctor she became involved with at the end of her life. But again, these were emotional relationships that she needed. I don't personally think that they were sexual relationships. So, we don't know. I always say it doesn't matter, but people want to know, and people, are always asking, and we just don't have a definitive answer other than I think Eleanor Roosevelt was very Victorian in her morals, and that it would have been outside of her framework to have extramarital affairs.
So we talked a little bit about relationships with politics. Can you talk about politicians, I should say, his relationship with the press? I mean, obviously you talked about a mastery of radio, both of them. What about also Congress or the Supreme Court? Any thoughts on that?
Three very different questions. We'll start with the press. FDR held 998 press conferences during his 12 years in office. And his press conferences, particularly in the early days, he would just open the doors and they would come into the Oval Office, and he would sit around the Oval Office and they would talk. And all of the transcripts of those press conferences are available on our website. Some of them are fascinating. He would always say everything is off the record, and he would sort of have this banter with them, and he would occasionally feed them information for their stories. And the press who covered him loved him. They really did. Their bosses hated him. Basically, every major newspaper in America endorsed his opponent in every election that he ran. So it was a split feeling there. But the reporters really loved him, and they had an agreement with the Roosevelt White House that they wouldn't show FDR's disability. So they never took pictures of him in a wheelchair. He had to be lifted and carried out of a car every time he went anywhere. He often would, have to be carried and positioned up to the lectern when he was giving speeches. And they did not film it. You can see some of the outtakes of the newsreel footage. Whoever's doing the introduction to FDR, the camera's on the podium. They introduce FDR, the camera pans away to the audience clapping. Once FDR's back at the podium, the camera pans back. So it was a real agreement, something that would never happen today, but it was a collaboration between the press and FDR. Now, and FDR had, in his first election in 1932, he had a dominant control of both houses, the Senate and House. He had supermajorities. He increased those supermajorities in 1936 when he was reelected. He lost a little bit of his power in terms of Congress in 1940. But so he had supermajorities, particularly in the early days, who wanted him to succeed because the country was in such desperate shapes. He had a contentious relationship with the Southern Democrats, who were very conservative, Jim Crow laws, anti-civil rights, isolationist. He actually had a lot of trouble with the Southern Democrats from his own party. When he was elected in 1940, actually before the election of 1940, he appointed two Republicans, one to be the Secretary of War and the other to be Secretary of the Navy. So he had a complicated relationship with Congress. He was a master at getting legislation accomplished. You look at his first 100 days, 15 pieces, extraordinarily complicated, major pieces of legislation. You've just never seen anything like that since then. Legislation is not like an executive order. You can't just write something down and sign it. Legislation means both houses of Congress passed it. His relationship with the Supreme Court was very contentious, especially in the early days, because after a few years, they started striking down many of the critical New Deal legislation that was trying to help people. And FDR floated the idea of, after the 1936 election, of stacking the Supreme Court, adding one new judge for every judge over the age of 70, which would have brought the total up to 15, so that they could help with the workload. And this was such a sort of outrageous idea that even his own party rejected it, and it never came to pass. But through natural evolution, a couple of justices retired, new justices came in, and they shifted their support for the New Deal. And he ended up appointing some of the most important federal judges, Supreme Court justices in the history of America. He ended up appointing 8 Supreme Court justices.
We're getting close to the end of time here. I do have a couple of presidential library questions for you. So can you talk about, I know there's the Roosevelt Institute, some of the, every presidential library has different configurations of a foundation that supports it. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship, what the library does versus what they do?
Sure. So the FDR Presidential Library and Museum is a part of the National Archives. It's a federal agency. We're responsible for preserving and protecting these records. The federal government pays for the building, for the staffing, etc. However, the federal government will not pay for things like special exhibits, websites, programming, educational efforts. So all of that sort of things that we associate with museums have to be paid for with private money. So the Roosevelt Institute, originally it was the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute. It's now just the Roosevelt Institute. They are the 501c3 that funnels private money to help us do these programs. The Roosevelt Institute, like many of the other presidential library foundations, also have other efforts that they're involved with. One is the Campus Network, which is an extraordinary collection of groups across the country. I think about 10,000 students involved at over 150 campuses, who are designed to train the next generation of political leaders. They come to Hyde Park. A group of their leaders come to Hyde Park every summer. It's a very inspiring experience with them. And then the Roosevelt Institute has a think tank where they bring together great minds who develop new progressive economic policy ideas based on the core beliefs of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. So the three different units work separately, but work together. And Felicia Wong, who's the CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, has done a really remarkable job.
Yeah, she's terrific. We have a group in New Jersey interested in putting together a new presidential library for Grover, Cleveland. Any advice for them? This might be a longer answer. They might want to follow up with you directly.
Well, I mean, I think you have to define what you want to do. So we have, multiple functions because we are both a federal repository, we are an educational center, we are a research center, and we're a museum. So the big question is, what are you trying to do? You want to be a museum to tell that story so people have a better understanding of the time and the man? Then that's a great thing to do, because the thing I love about presidential libraries is that they're these slices of American history, and that they really dive deep into that period of American history. And so whether you're looking at the Reagan Library or the Kennedy Library, you can drill down and really see what was happening in America during that period, unlike other museums which have much broader scopes. So in that sense, telling that story of that period of American history is an important thing to do. Then there's the idea of, are you making available the records of that administration to help researchers come in? Have you accumulated enough volume of material to really be a research center? And that's the other thing you have to decide, because that's a whole different sort of institution.
Very good. Well, before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to plug what might be coming up. So we're all going to think about the sunnier days later in the year where we're reopened, people are coming. You might not have that sort of calendar set, but any universities, exhibits, big programs, maybe next year you're looking at, or even later this year that you want folks to know about?
Well, we originally had planned to open an exhibit in March of 2020, which was called FDR's Final Campaign. And it looks at that last sort of year when he's running for office, and the war in Europe and the development of the United Nations, and he's campaigning for his very life because of his illness. And it weaves those four threads together. And so at this point, we're planning on opening that exhibit when we reopen, hopefully this spring or this summer, to tell that story. And then in 2022, we were hoping to do an exhibit on the Roosevelts and civil rights, and look at what their policies affected African Americans, how Eleanor worked with the civil rights leaders in the 50s and 60s, and to try to reveal some of the structural inequalities that, despite both Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt being very progressive, there were certain things they just couldn't do. Many of the New Deal legislation excluded African Americans from the benefits. So it's an important thing to look at, to understand what people talk about when they talk about structural racism. Sometimes it's not racism, it's the politics of what you can accomplish. And we think it's an important story to tell.
That's terrific to look forward to. So in the meantime, folks can, as you mentioned earlier, find you online, explore and research. And I will give a pitch to everyone out there to go visit when the opportunity gives you that that chance because it's a terrific property. The museum is wonderful, and I was a shopper at your gift store too. So all in all, it'll be a great day to visit. Well, Paul, I want to thank you for the time. The presentation was fantastic. Questions, a lot of positive vibes coming in from the chat for your presentation and your remarks and answers to the questions. So thank you. And we are going to wrap up our time with you. And I look forward to getting back up to see you when the time allows too. Or we'll see you down here in Washington when we're allowed to travel again.
Thanks very much. It was an honor to be here. I really appreciate it. I hope you all come up to Hyde Park. The Hudson Valley is beautiful. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul. And it's a great way to kick off our 2021 program series. We hope our visitors will make their way up there when the chance gives them the opportunity. I want to thank all of our donors and sponsors, supporters. If you're not a member of the National Archives Foundation, you can join today by visiting archivesfoundation.org. And it's a new year, and yet the archive still has one of the hottest museum stores to shop in. I want to thank those of you who supported the foundation with a purchase during the holidays, but it's 2021, and when this program's over, go online to nationalarchivesstore.org to see some of the great things we've got. We've got some terrific FDR items as well. And then I want to make sure that you join us for our next set of programs in February. The archives itself has a number of great virtual programs celebrating Black History Month. We've got two programs, one on February 18th at 5 o'clock, Cocktail Conversations with Derek Brown. Many of you will remember him. He was our mixologist in expert for our Rightfully Hers show, excuse me, not Rightfully Hers, Spirit of Republic show a few years ago. He's going to be doing a program called Temperance, Prohibition, and the Alcohol-Free Cocktail Movement. So I hope you'll join us for that on the 18th. And then on February 24th, join us for a conversation with Maxim Thorne of the Andrew Goodman Foundation called Freedom Sumner, Inspiring Young Voters Today. And what the Andrew Goodman Foundation, how a civil rights murder in 1964 is inspiring a national movement of young people to vote and engage in civic life. It'll be a really fascinating conversation. We've got a couple other speakers who will join him to talk about what's happening today on campuses. You can find out more about our programs online. You can follow us on social media and obviously sign up for our emails. So as always, the National Archives is our nation's memory. What is past is prologue. Until next time, thank you on behalf of the National Archives Foundation for joining us today.